Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We've now arrived at a turning point in our discussions. The next panel is tasked with building on the remarkable insights we've heard so far and looking forward aggressively. Where do the win-win solutions exist? What is the role of entrepreneurship in seeking them? This panel will be chaired by Dr. Patrick Gregorian, the president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Dr. Gregorian is well known to many of us. Earlier, he served as the president of Brown University and the New York Public Library. He's been decorated by the French, Italian, Austrian, and Portuguese governments. His numerous civic and academic honors include over 60 honorary degrees. He's president of one of our nation's most important grant-making organizations, a globally renowned thought leader, and has, in that role of being president of that organization, been an innovator and an entrepreneur in his own right. Dr. Gregorian.
Good morning. Last night I could not sleep because I was thinking of today's conference. It's such a broad subject. Challenges are so many. So I just wanted to enumerate some of them because we'll not be dealing with them, and then have our distinguished panel address some of them. I've been very worried about information explosion and inflation of information, fragmentation of knowledge, and creating over-specialized society of specialists talking to specialists. Namely, general public is missing picture. How to educate the public about the challenges facing us in scientific terms at a time when technology is most welcome and used by everyone, especially dictators and authoritarian people love technology, but they do not love science because science will be requiring openness, questioning, and others. And it's miraculous that in this 21st century, there are societies, including ours, in which some 50–60% don't believe in evolution, don't believe in environmental problems facing us, and don't believe in science. The science is challenged, as in the name of Galileo, they challenged science, which is very sad for me as a former university president. So second thing that I like to mention, there was in the 17th century great philosopher, René Descartes, a scientist as well, who said the public has to be taught to have faith in scientists, in science. Even if they don't understand, scientists and philosophers as a class have to be respected because they're in the business of creating and exploring knowledge. Unfortunately, that faith on the part of public now is also diminishing on certain places by either religious fundamentalism or political football. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I was very much worried. Lord Grey, in 1914, mentioned a line which has stuck in my mind all these years. It's easy to mobilize. It's very hard to demobilize. Demagogues and ideologues and others can mobilize, but once a mobilization has done, it's very hard to demobilize. So how to mobilize for good causes and how to be able to demobilize if we're not right. And then, of course, this morning I came last part of the thing about unemployment, youth unemployment, poverty, inequality within societies, and lack of democratic process elsewhere. In our case, in the case of the United States, we face, because it's a global issue, not us, so I'm addressing that, we're forced to go from unipolar to multipolar attitude, not by conviction alone, but because of financial situation. I was surprised that all the wars America has fought, from Revolutionary War 1812, including Civil War, World War I, World War II, America had planned how to finance it, except the current one. We charge it to Visa card. They charge it, and the banker may be China and others. And as a result, there is no awareness, the cost of the war, except in the form of national debt and others. And then, last point I want to mention is that we have, America and others, limited resources to do many things. So priorities are necessary, public-private partnerships are necessary, entrepreneurship is necessary. Namely, we need all of us to be in it together, working together, because we are in it together. With that, I want to introduce this distinguished panel. It's wonderful, having read some of their works, to see them in person. I'm awestruck. Marc Perrin de Brichambaut was Secretary General of Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe until 2011. I was asking this morning whether he got his white hair from that job, but thank God he still has hair. Prior to taking up the post in June 2005, he was Conseiller d'État in the Conseil d'État, France's highest administrative court. Since entering public service in 1974, he had held a variety of senior positions in the French civil service, including ambassador and head of the French delegation to OSCE from 1991 to 1994. A graduate of the École Normale Supérieure de Saint-Cloud, the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, and École Normale de l'Administration, Marc Perrin de Brichambaut is respected commentator, international affairs, but above all as an original thinker. Then there's Sir David King, who is the director of Smith School, Enterprise and Environment at the University of Oxford. He's currently Chancellor of the University of Liverpool, Senior Scientific Advisor to UBS, and Science Advisor to President Kagame of Rwanda. He also serves as Chair of the UK National Oceanographic Centre Advisory Board, as Governor and Council member of the Ditchley Foundation, as a member of the European Research Area Board, as a trustee of the Ecological Sequestration Trust, and it's a member of Sustainability Advisory Board of DSM in Holland. He's a non-executive director of Midatech Limited and Green Exchange LLC. He also works with the President Gorbachev on Green Cross International Foundation. It's remarkable that notwithstanding all of that, he has time to come here and to participate in this conference. He was, I should add one more line, he was the UK's government's chief scientific advisor and head of the Government Office of Science from October 2000 to 2007. In that time, he raised the profile of the need of the government to act on climate change and was instrumental in creating the new $1 billion Energy Technology Institute. He is one of those original thinkers who's also doer, because I divide people talkers, doers, and thinkers. Sometimes thinkers combine doers and talkers, but not always. In this case, they do. And Khalid Malik, about whom I know a lot, don't ask me why, for some I went alphabetically, is a development economist with extensive leadership, research, and advocacy experience. Born in Pakistan and educated at University of Oxford, and he did Cambridge also, he did Essex also, and added Punjab on the top of it, so it'll be acceptable to all the constituencies from Harris. Mr. Malik has had a long, distinguished career with the UN. He was appointed director of UNDP Human Development Report in June 2011. Previously, he served as special advisor to new development partnerships in 2010-2011. UN resident coordinator of China. He was director evaluation office and then a UN representative to Uzbekistan. Earlier, he worked as a senior economist and program manager in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and on science and technology matters. Before joining UN, Mr. Malik taught and conducted research at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, 1975, at the Pembroke College at Oxford, 74-75. He has been invited to speak Club de Rome, Dubois Forum, Asia's Davos. Why you say Asia's Davos, rather than Davos is Europe's power? Let's not be Eurocentric in that. Mr. Malik has written widely on a range of topics. He co-edited a review of the lessons learned in crisis and post-conflict situation, capacity for development, new solutions, and many other great works. Now I come to last but not least, Lester Brown. I'm familiar with his work because he writes with great clarity, and he is kind of universal in his scope without sacrificing excellent research. So he has been called by Washington Post as one of the world's most influential thinkers. The Telegraph of Calcutta, to outshine Washington Post, refers him as the guru of the environmental movement. In 1986, Library of Congress requested his personal papers, noting that his writings have already strongly affected thinking about problems of world population and resources. Brown started his career as a farmer, growing tomatoes, not tomatoes, in southern New Jersey with his younger brother during high school and college. Shortly after earning a degree in agricultural science from Rutgers University in 1955, he spent 6 months living in rural India, where he became intimately familiar with the food population issue. In 1959, Brown joined the United States Department of Agriculture Foreign Agriculture Service, and he's done many accomplishments. I'm not going to read the rest of it, except to say we are tremendously honored to have such distinguished thinkers, doers, and activists in the fields of the respective fields. With that, I give you my first speaker, but I have also to warn you, because I was in the previous session, those of you who have questions afterwards, please ask questions, don't give speeches. If you want to give speeches, see the foundation here. They'll put you next year's session as speakers. And be brief, as I was not, in order to give chance for speakers to speak more on the subject and for you to be able to ask questions. Mr. Brichambaut.
Thank you, Dr. Gregorian. Good morning to all. I feel at this stage of the conference we've reached a moment where we need to talk about mechanics a little bit. What strategies are we going to devise to try and start addressing all those issues which we have identified in the last 24 hours? They're all global issues. They require the cooperation and input from practically the whole of the international community. We know how simple it is. We've just had a glimpse in the last session of how the United States plan to address those issues very forcefully. So we are under no illusions. This is still a season. Presidential elections are going on. There are some important ones still down the road. Not the right time to make big strategic decisions. And we also know somewhere in the back of our mind what we would need. I recently ran across a wonderful article by Professor Thomas Weiss, which is called What Happened to the Idea of World Government? And it depicts the intellectual scenery in this country between 1946 and 1951-52. It was dominated by the idea of creating world government. Now, I suspect anybody who would go around promoting this would be sent straight to Guantanamo, so I'm not going to do so, but we have to be realists. What is a toolbox on which we collectively can act? I will on purpose not focus on any of the aspects that have been raised, but I have them all in mind if we want to be doing something concrete. And I think there are three areas where there are developments which allow us to join and to participate and to make an input before the global leadership re-emerges again, but we certainly badly need this global leadership. We need it in the US, we need it in the EU, we need it in China, we need it in every other country. The first area where there much more has been going on that has been meeting the eye and that has caught the attention of the public is international organizations. Yes, we have elements of global governance at work right now, today, through international organizations. We have whole sectors of international life which de facto have been entrusted to specialized institutions. I name humanitarian action, coordinating development assistance, pandemics management. We have this extraordinary tool which is Global UN Conference, next one in Rio, which are huge machineries to create awareness, to develop concepts, and to create networks of civil society, of states, in order to create the conditions for action. They may be very frustrating. We have never invented anything best so far. Second, we have international organizations which have become a place where global conscience has been emerging in terms of affirming universal values in human rights, in the basic role of democracy, that have created international tribunals and have those tribunals effectively working. This is a huge progress, and this is potentially a framework for a form of global conscience on other issues like global warming and like environmental protection. We have international organizations which have created a symbiotic working relationship with the cockpit of the international communities. The coordination that goes on in groups like the G20, which have been trying to address the question of the financial crisis and have done so fairly successfully. The G20 discusses, it has no secretariat, it tasks the different institutions, and they deliver, they do their job, they translate norms and objectives into practical realities. We also all know the limitations of that. We have international organizations which have invented completely new ways of governance, multi-stakeholder arrangements. How would internet work without the ad hoc constructions which have been created, which mix private sector, NGOs, governments, such as the ICANN and the International Forum for Internet Governance. So international organizations are lively, they create new things. They help to create consensus, they help to relieve the burden of the major power in terms of crisis prevention. After all, the UN has an army of 100,000 people, which basically is in the job of stabilizing all the most difficult conflicts in Africa with practically no input from the major powers. Not bad altogether. And each organization, international organization creates its culture, which of course states do not always like. Who wants many Dag Hammarskjölds around the planet? They would create a different dimension and a different drive and a different type of leadership in addressing the issues which we have in front of us. But still, they create fantastic networks among all sorts of interested actors and a real global civil society. US invented those international organizations. It is a fact that it is not anymore exercising more than a sort of benign, semi-passive aggressive lead in them. Others will have to come up. Second element, regional organizations. They are the great success story of the period. It is thanks to the European regional organizations that we have had an unknown success in managing the succession of the Soviet Empire, of the Russian, of the Soviet Union, and of the Federal Republic of Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Messy as far as Yugoslavia was concerned, but ultimately not an all-out war. Recourse to force was constrained, and a host of new tools were invented: High Commission, national minorities, field offices, ULEX right now in Kosovo, in order to manage the consequences of those conflicts, to keep them circumscribed, to keep the worst factors at bay. And the most extraordinary thing that the regional organizations have invented is a phenomenon of inclusion. Were it not for the dual enlargements of NATO and the EU to Central and Eastern Europe, the whole question of creating peace and stability in Central and Eastern Europe would have had to be addressed very differently. When you do not have this European perspective, this Europe pool, then you have a problem. So let us bear in mind that this is being taken up as an example. The African Union has risen to its duties in terms of peacekeeping, of trying to prevent conflicts. Imperfect, but there it is. And our latest discovery has been the role of the Arab League, both in Libya and in Syria, creating a local identity which has given a degree of legitimacy, a sharing of values which is very important. Ultimately, what the regional organizations do is they assert the primacy of the universal values of human rights and democracy. And they find ways for the local groups to build them on a sort of permanent peer-to-peer interaction. What better, affordable, practical, non-military way to create the conditions that make it possible to address the bigger problems? And I would like to pay tribute to the third component, which I believe is immensely important. We're all familiar with the role of the larger global NGOs who sort of pioneered being a global conscience. What we also know is that for a CNN which created other channels, Al Jazeera and many others, there is the same phenomenon. The big international human rights NGOs have spawned a host of NGOs all around the world, and we now have global networks dedicated to all the issues that are close to us, that are effective, that work very closely with the UN, with a specialized organization, that will swamp the conference in Rio. I've had to attempt some of these conferences. You have a hard time finding the delegates from the States. You are overpowered by the importance of civil society, which is there altogether. And this is immensely important. It relies on the achievements of groups of experts. The climate change panel is an extraordinary example of this. We now have independent sources of legitimacy which are internationally recognized and which can sort of ring the alarm bells, and which do so, and which are increasingly listened to. Let us not forget the role of the private sector. Davos, after all, may not be everybody's taste, but it is a place where great global issues are addressed, because it is in the interest of multinationalized private capital to see the problems coming and to try and find common solutions. So de facto, we have a global civil society. It is as multiple and as rich as all the elements of our civil societies. We are all here, part of it in a way, in the way we are working together. What is important is that we have to energize it, demultiply it, and transform it into a place where we devise action strategies in order, and every opportunity, to push this common conscience, this common awareness of the urgency of the challenges which we have ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, I am delighted to be here with you and want to congratulate the organizers on a quite remarkable meeting, a meeting of minds that I can honestly say I've not managed to get to before. My challenge is to describe to you what it is that is already being done and further things that need to be done in order to meet the very real challenges that we are faced with on the planet. These are 21st century challenges. Our civilization has never had to face up to these challenges before. We've always had enough food, energy, and water around, enough land. We could move if we wrecked a piece of land. We could move to another piece of land. We had so much in the way of global commons that we thought we would never wreck them. With 7 billion people on the planet and 9 billion people coming up, we have new challenges. We have to rethink. The ways of thinking in the 20th century are irrelevant to the direction we need to be going in now. And let me just take you through some of the arguments for this change. My first is going to be, oh, this figure's come up so small, I guess you can't see it. It's going to be to say, in addition to what we're doing in terms of climate change, and this is the biggest of all the challenges we're faced with, because we're faced with the destruction of our civilization if we don't manage it. But in addition to this being a long-term problem, I'm going to say it's also a short-term problem, because we've been relying on fossil fuels to provide the energy since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to energize all of our developments. But fossil fuels will not be around forever. And one of the interesting factors is, whereas I thought we had a virtually infinite supply of fossil fuels, we do not. We have already reached what appears to be a global production maximum in oil production capacity. So if I just look at crude oil production, and the graphs don't show this very adequately, but the bottom graph is the one I'm referring to, we're plotting there global crude oil production as a function of price, not as a function of year. But all of the data points up to 2005 correspond to a relatively small increase in price, $20 to $40 a barrel. And the production increased from 64 million barrels a day to 74 million barrels a day. Since then, we have never exceeded 75 million barrels a day, but the price of oil has gone from $40 to $140 a barrel, and up and down, because as the global economy collapsed, demand for oil came down, and so the price came down. And then as the economy took off again, we're now seeing that last year, more than $100 a barrel was the price of oil through the whole year. What does that mean for our economies? Your economy, drastic. You're spending $1 billion a day on imported oil here in the United States. Never mind what you're finding in the Gulf of Mexico. Never mind what you're importing from Canada. Those are relatively small amounts compared with your annual import that you will continue to need. It's also $1 billion a day in Europe, and if you want to know the real factor behind a debt crisis in countries like Italy, have a look at their deficit, which is in Italy 38 billion euro per annum, and what they're additionally paying for oil since 2005. Imported oil is costing Italy 34 billion euro a year. The oil crisis is the big elephant in the room that economists don't want to discuss. It's here. 2005 is the turning point for managing a production capacity of 75 million barrels a day. And now I'm going to say to you, if you look at the United States energy information that is coming out, there's a prediction that the planet will consume another 30% of oil by that time. 30% of oil, given that oil fields are diminishing in production capacity by 5% per annum over the world, that means we've got to find at least as much oil again. Another 66 million barrels a day, remember today we're at 74, needs to be discovered. It's not yet discovered if we're actually going to achieve that. It's not heroic to say we're going to achieve that. It's totally misleading. We have to begin to defossilize our economies now. And I come back then to actions that are taking place. When I was in the British government in 2003, I persuaded the Blair government that they should have a policy of reducing emissions by 60%, emissions of carbon dioxide by 2050. That then meant that when I went negotiating around the world, I had a very strong negotiating card, which is I'm not negotiating for a minimal impact on the British economy. The British are already saying this is what we're going to do. President Lula, what are you going to do? I said when I met him. It's not a question of let's negotiate the least impact on our countries, but rather challenging each other to do more to manage the affairs of the planet. And we've gone a very long way since then. When we got to 2005, the G8 meeting, Blair was in the presidency, and I persuaded him to put climate change at the top of the agenda. We invented the G8 plus 4. Blair and I sat down and made it G8 plus 4. It then became G8 plus 5 because we knew we had to have the big growing economies present to discuss properly how to manage climate change. So this cockpit that Marc has referred to, I think became the engine for action that we managed to pursue that. Now it's the G20, and we have continued the discussions at heads of state level. Heads of states, absolutely critical. Now, I also have to tell you that I think that Copenhagen was not a disaster. I thought Copenhagen went very well because basically the idea that 193 nations would simply sign a document, problem solved, was pie in the sky, particularly since the United States was never going to be a signatory to that. Therefore, voluntary arrangements from each country became the mechanism for going forward. And there we were in a process of challenging each other to do more. I remember at Durban, the Chinese representative, the Chinese climate ambassador, standing up in a fury because the the European Union representative had said, we are doing more than any other region of the world to reduce emissions. We're doing a lot. And he was furious because he thought China was doing more. That's what I mean by muscular bilateralism, pushing each other into competing to reducing emissions. Indonesia, we will reduce emissions by 26% by 2020. And what you saw as a result of Copenhagen and President Calderon's pushing this through at Mexico and then in Durban, is this rising challenge from one country after another. I've worked with the president of Rwanda to produce a green growth and climate resilience strategy for the country. Their economy has been growing for 12 years at 8% per annum. I guarantee you that we will now accelerate that to 10% per annum as a green growth strategy. Why? Because we're going to decouple the economy from oil dependence. Oil dependence is one of the major factors holding their economic growth back, as it is yours, by the way. As we move forward in time, decoupling from oil dependence becomes an economic necessity. It's not something nice to do. It becomes an economic necessity. And by the way, don't rest too well in your beds thinking about how much gas can be fracked out of the continent of the United States that you're sitting on. There is a lot of hype about fracking. Look at the reduction year on year from fracking fields in gas production, and you'll find that it's between 50 and 90%. The easy gas comes as you begin fracking, and then it gets more and more difficult to achieve more. So the cost effectiveness of fracking reduces with time. So as with oil, the question is not how much is there, but how much is economically available. And I'm suggesting that at $100 a barrel of oil, it's not economically viable. We are now spending more than $1 trillion a year. We, Europe and the United States, spending more than $1 trillion a year in the Middle East for oil. Not a smart move of money given the financial crisis that we're faced with, given the crumbling economies. Now, I just want to say very quickly, in Britain, we have set in train a process. And by 2050, we will have reduced our emissions by 80%. It's all built in through Parliament. We've got a full parliamentary agreement on a statute so that the private sector knows that when it invests in low-carbon futures, it's going to be a long-term investment. So if you want the details, I can give it to you because I've been working closely with the government on how we manage that process. But we've got a carbon budget established in 4-year periods through a climate change committee set up by Parliament with no votes against in Parliament. This climate change committee sets a budget every 4 years, and it's now set out to 2025 for the UK to see that we manage this transition. As we do it, watch our economy grow, because we've finished our North Sea oil bubble. That is on the wane. We need to generate all our energy within the country to stop these imports. This is actually the only way for us to economically make our way into the future. So as we move forward in time, it's not only the importance globally to manage these problems, but it's the importance nationally. So when I look at these issues, I'm looking at issues that require new global thinking to go beyond national borders. Thank you.
Let me just start by thanking the organizers, and to echo what David just said, that really it's been a wonderful learning experience for many of us, and to bring together this community of people who believe there is such a thing as affordable world security. And we want to particularly acknowledge Bill Pope's great leadership and to wish him a full and speedy recovery. We miss him here. Yesterday, someone talked about human security. And it was one of these comments from the floor. But to me, there was kind of an aha moment. And that's what I would like to talk about. So it's a slightly different pace and focus on how to do these things. But to me, getting the concepts right is profoundly important. And that is what will allow us to move forward collectively as a world and as nations, and in the way we think about security. A few days ago, a few of us were in Istanbul at a Global Human Development Forum, trying to address how equity and sustainability come together for the purposes of bringing the world and the conversation about the world at Rio +20 this June. And that's profoundly important, and this came up in many ways, and particularly in the speakers before me, but also yesterday as well. that our concept of these matters has to be broadened, has to be made more relevant. I'm privileged to be heading an office which has been trying to change people's thinking for some time, since 1990. And the 1990 Human Development Report starts with a very simple statement. People are the wealth of nations, not guns or planes or even gross domestic product. And how do we then take this powerful idea and make this organizing principle to look at security as well? And I would like to also acknowledge that since that time, we received enormous support from people who believe in this idea of human development. And I would like to acknowledge in particular, of course, the great visionary leadership of Dr. Mahbubul Haq, the late Dr. Mahbubul Haq, who did this job of mine right from the beginning, who jointly with Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, really advanced this idea and concept forward. And to acknowledge the early band of supporters. Principal of them is President Oscar, who is here, was a great supporter of this human development concept. So if you allow me, I'll say a few words on some of these issues. The first point is there's a kind of a back to the future moment about all of this conversation. And maybe when we first started talking about human security, it was not necessarily the right time to do it. When we raised in 1994 the report talked about human security, we were vilified by many governments, and many questioned how is it that an agency devoted to human development, devoted to development, is talking about security. And somehow you can't connect these two, but now we see that this is an essential part of that issue. The 1994 report, and I will welcome people to look at it, tries to cast this whole issue in terms of freedoms. The freedom from fear, protection of individuals from direct threats to their safety and physical integrity, threats from people, other people, but also states. And that's a very powerful way of looking at something. Second, freedom from want. We talked yesterday about jobs, meeting basic needs. Surveys done for the Pakistani Taliban show that 70% of the young men in the Pakistani Taliban are doing it for just jobs. Someone has given them something to do. A third part is life with dignity. If you do not have job security, income security, health security, environmental and food security, and personal security, something doesn't work well. Society doesn't come together. And these are very powerful ways of looking at how we address this profound issue. And it's also very relevant because it's universal. Threats may vary. Hunger and disease might be an issue in poorer countries. Drugs, crime in richer countries. But if that security is attacked, all nations stand to suffer from that. And they are likely to get involved. And this is as true of drug trafficking, pollution, as it is true of many things we talked about yesterday. And this is rather sad in some ways that we all know it's less costly to prevent these issues from arising than it is to deal with the crisis. But somehow we never manage to do that. And we know that humanitarian efforts, it's easy to raise money for it, but much more difficult to raise money for long-term development. And I was a little kind of saddened by the conversations about $500 billion and $1 trillion spent on defense and armaments. And then also somehow in the earlier session, a question, a concern, is that increasing our security or not? So the thesis I would like to leave with you is collective prosperity leads to collective security. And that's a profound one. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is about the changing world. In 1820, China and India together were roughly 50% of the world's output. In another 20 years, that reality is going to re-emerge. And it's happening very rapidly. But it's in a different world. We're much more connected to each other. And therefore, we have to address a very central question. Where are our shared values? And how do we bring the world together into addressing these issues and concerns? Someone Marc mentioned earlier the issue of global regional institutions. There is an infrastructure out there which is trying to do the best it can. But again, I will submit that infrastructure is somewhat challenged. It's challenged in somehow coping with the present realities, but really it is challenged in terms of, very challenged in terms of dealing with the future which is fast coming to us. In some ways, we need new norms which emphasize intergenerational equity, that somehow the choices we make today for this generation do not compromise the choices of the future generations. It's as true of environment, as true of the stability of society, and jobs, and all these issues are profoundly connected to it. So in the remaining few minutes I have, I'd like to talk a little bit about the more operational aspects, the doing part of how do we take the next step, what are the principles underlining it. Amartya Sen, a few years ago, produced, I think, really an extraordinary book called The Idea of Justice, and making an argument that actually social justice is what fairness, and this came up also yesterday, drives a lot of people's assessment, understanding of themselves. The Arab Spring, the Occupy Wall Street movement are all manifestations of that. So somehow we have to find a way to move to a fairer, more just world. And in that conversation, addressing the principal elements of human security become essential. All human beings have the same rights, and we have to keep that in mind. So we need these new concepts to become our default concept. And these new concepts have to be driven, I hope, through global conversations, Rio being a very important opportunity for all of us. We have great opportunities now through social media. In Istanbul, someone mentioned the new TGIF concept, the new Twitter, Google, Internet, Facebook reality. It is amazing what you can do with an idea these days, how much you can mobilize. In Rio, you will have a small intergovernmental group of people, but a massive civil society presence. They're expecting 100 to 200,000 people coming there. And finally, we have to make people themselves take charge of the future. I think in the end, whether it's international organizations or governments, we have to empower ourselves, because without that empowerment, we will not find the solutions. And I hope we live and see a world where guns and investments in defense expenditures is no longer seen as a central issue for us to discuss about about security, but rather human beings themselves. Thank you very much.
I will be looking at security in with a much broader lens, partly because that's what I do. I try to look at the big picture. We have inherited a definition of security from the 20th century. It was a century dominated by 2 world wars and a Cold War. We've brought that definition with us into the 21st century as though it is still the way we should be defining security. But when I ask myself, what are the threats to our security today in the 21st century, not the 20th century, the 21st century, and I start with a clean pad and I make a list. Climate change, population growth, water shortages, rising food prices, failing states. These are the threats to our security. On my list, armed aggression doesn't even make the top 5. As I look ahead and try to see where things are going and where the wake-up calls will be coming from, I think food is probably the weak link in the system, as it was for many of the earlier civilizations whose archaeological sites we study today. It was the salt buildup in the soil that lowered wheat yields and later barley yields and brought down the Sumerian civilization. It was deforestation and soil erosion that undermined the Mayan civilization, the most advanced civilization in the Western Hemisphere. As I look ahead, I see food becoming a central issue. World grain prices today are double those of 5 years ago. And unfortunately, this is not just a temporary surge. It's going to go back to the historical level this year or next year or at any time in the foreseeable future. It is more likely that grain prices will rise in the future than that they will rise further in the future than that they will decline. We used to have 2 major food security cushions in the world food economy. One was idled cropland in the United States. When I joined the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1959, we were paying farmers not to plant part of their land in order to support grain prices. And this became actually the support for the world grain price because the U.S. figured so prominently. And so whenever there was a poor harvest somewhere in the world and things would tighten up, we would calculate how much of the idle land we would bring back the following year. It was pretty easy. We also at that time had huge stocks of grain. And so in 1965, when the Indian monsoon failed, we shipped 1/5 of our wheat harvest to India. Not a big problem. We can't do that today. We're looking at a situation now where we don't have the idled cropland anymore. We're flat out in production. We don't have large stocks. We have minimal stocks. And we're trying to rebuild them, but we have not been able to. As a result, we're sort of living harvest to harvest. And then the question becomes, what if we have a major shortfall somewhere in the world? I was thinking in 2010, we were looking at the heat wave in Russia. Remember the footage of things burning and smoke in the streets of Moscow in the evening news? That heat wave, which lasted from late June into early August, reduced the Russian grain harvest by 40%. They've been hoping for about 100 million tons. It dropped down to 60 million tons. That tightened world grain supplies. Then we look at what would have happened if that heat wave had been centered not in Moscow, but in Chicago. And if the U.S. had lost 40% of its grain harvest, which would have been 40% of 400 million tons or 160 million tons. If that heat wave had been centered in Chicago, we would have had chaos in world grain markets. Grain exporters would have been restricting exports to keep their food prices down. Oil exporting countries would have been bartering oil for grain to make sure they had enough grain to feed their people. And many countries would essentially have been shut out. There would be chaos in world grain markets. And that would affect financial markets and the financial stability in the world. A system that incidentally rests very much on confidence. One of the reasons we've not been able to rebuild stocks in the last few years, get them back to a safe level, is because farmers are facing three new challenges now. One is climate change. Agriculture as it exists today evolved over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. There were few blips here and there, basically quite stable. But now, that climate system is changing. And so the agricultural system and the climate system are more and more out of sync with each other with each passing year. That makes it more difficult to expand production quickly. We are also now hitting a glass ceiling with grain yields. In the more agriculturally advanced countries, farmers are no longer raising yields. In Japan, rice yields plateaued about 15 years ago. Same for South Korea. In Europe, wheat yields are no longer rising in France, Germany, or the UK, the three leading wheat producers. Why? Basically, farmers have caught up with scientists. They're doing everything they know to do, and there's not anything else left. So yields, which have been rising for decades, have now plateaued in some of the more agriculturally advanced countries. And with each passing year, as more and more countries hit this glass ceiling, we'll have this plateau effect in the world grain harvest. The third thing is the water situation. We've been expanding world grain production in the last few decades in part by overpumping aquifers, which by definition is a short-term phenomenon. You can overpump in the short run, but not in the long run. Half the world's people now live in countries where agricultural output is partly dependent on overpumping. And that includes the big three grain producers, China, India, the United States. World Bank data show that in India, 175 million people are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. My estimate for China is 120 million. Chinese are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. You added these numbers up for countries around the world, and you realize that when these aquifers are depleted and the rate of pumping is necessarily reduced to the rate of recharge, there will be a dramatic drop in production. We're seeing this most dramatically, by the way, in Saudi Arabia, which for 30 years has been self-sufficient in wheat production. But where the aquifer they've been pumping is now almost gone, and wheat production in Saudi Arabia is collapsing. It's not a big problem for the Saudis. They can compete in the world market, but it is a dramatic example of what can and will be happening in some other countries. So we have the food situation. It used to be, just to show how complex things are becoming, it used to be that food security was the responsibility of the Ministry of Agriculture. That's no longer true. It's the responsibility of the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Transportation, the Ministry of Health and Family Planning. We've got a huge challenge now with food security, and I don't think we've yet realized it. I was in Beijing some time ago, and I suggested they put a direct line between the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Energy so they could talk with each other, because the decisions being made in the Ministry of Energy were going to have a greater effect on China's future food security than those being made in the Ministry of Agriculture. So we have to rethink what these things mean. And let me close with just a few bright spots. David King was talking about countries ought to be competing to see who can do the most, and I quite agree. I quite agree. That's the way we ought to be approaching this. The good news is that in the United States, carbon emissions peaked in 2007, started to drop because of the economic downturn, but are continuing to decline. Our two big sources of carbon are coal and oil. With coal, we have an extraordinary campaign launched 3 years ago by the Sierra Club called the Beyond Coal Campaign. Their goal is to close every coal-fired power plant in the United States. As of today, we have 492 coal plants. 106 of them are scheduled to close, which means carbon emissions from using coal is going down very fast. But it's not just Sierra. There are many environmental groups, health groups, and others involved. Mayor Bloomberg of New York City gave the Sierra Club last summer $50 million to help fund their Beyond Coal campaign because he said coal has to go. And he's looking at it from both a health and a climate vantage point. So we're going to see in the United States a dramatic drop in carbon emissions as coal-fired power plants begin to close. There's a 475 megawatt plant just across the river in Virginia that will close by the 1st of October, for example, which means we'll have much cleaner air in Washington, D.C. than we've had in a long time. So this is one of the exciting things. And then oil consumption is also dropping in the United States. Three things involved here. One, someone mentioned earlier, young people aren't buying cars today the way my generation did, for example. And the baby boomers are starting to retire. Why is that important? I call this the demographics of gasoline use. When you retire, your gasoline consumption drops by 30 to 50% because you no longer have the daily commute. Not surprising, but the baby boomers, the largest age groups in our society, are now starting to retire. So each year, another age cohort will be reducing its gasoline use. And then we have, aside from these interesting demographics of young people and retirees, we have an extraordinary increase in the fuel efficiency of new cars sold in the United States. By 2025, the average car sold will be using half as much gasoline as the average car sold in 2010. So the basic point here is that carbon emissions in the United States, which have been going up for decades, and I don't think even most Americans yet have realized, are now dropping, and they're dropping fast. So we have the world's largest economy now dealing with the world's largest problem in a way that makes sense, and not all of it is conscious. I mean, some of this is just incidental, but things like fuel efficiency of cars, of course, very much government policy. So we have entirely new challenges today, and they are very real. And if there's any economic indicator more sensitive than the price of food, I don't know what it is. But if I were to pick three trends to watch, to sort of see where we're headed in the future, the first would be an economic trend, the price of grain. The second would be a social trend, the number of hungry people in the world. That was declining for some decades, and it is now rising. It got down to about 750 million. It's now up to 1 billion, and is in all likelihood will keep climbing if we stay with business as usual. And the third trend the third indicator is a political one, the number of failing states in the world. If you follow this field and the annual publication of the list of failing states in Foreign Policy magazine, you'll see that list is getting longer year by year. And it raises a disturbing question, which is how many failing states before we have a failing global civilization? We don't know the answer to that because we haven't been here before. But these are the kind of indicators we need to be looking at. It's not more advanced weapon systems. It's failing states we need to be focusing on and what to do about them. So we need to redefine security in much broader terms and in terms of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen, with a wonderful presentation. Now we have half an hour, or at least 27 minutes, of questioning. Please identify yourself and then ask the question, but don't give a speech, please, because let others have chance also to ask questions. Yes.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. My daughter was one of the students that occupied your office when you were president of Brown, and I apologize for that.
No, don't apologize. I'm very proud of that. Why even apologize?
Her father wanted to make sure she didn't she didn't have an arrest record. He was a judge.
Well, we erased it anyway.
Anyway. My question is, how do we make this amazing group into a community, and how we get energized to help take these extraordinary stories out to a much broader public. I would ask that all of you that have given speeches, if you had notes or read from a text, if you would let us see the hard copy, because it's easier than trying to listen through the 20 or 30 minutes that you did. But if you're willing to be a part of a community, and I'm into community building. It was a community that got the line in the President's State of the Union, the nation is a problem, we're addicted to oil, and we could all of a sudden start talking about it in this city. So my question is, how do we do that?
Well, what's your suggestion? One is, I had a question, only was alluded by Brichambaut. How has the emergence of social media affected the capacity of business and social entrepreneurs to drive social change? Only one you mentioned. Have you thought about how it could be mobilized, everything you're saying, through social media, because that gets quote a abused word, viral. I don't know why it goes viral, but then much better word. But anyway, it goes viral throughout the world. Is it the best way to organize a transnational community which will be concerned with the issues you discussed? Would you care to answer, Marc, that, and then Lester?
Well, picking up on your point, we recently had a very successful, I think, pictures circulated. I don't know whether it was on Facebook, but it was the head of the Lord's Army in Uganda, yeah, which is in the, not a very attractive character, which has been using boy soldiers and which is now in the hands of the International Criminal Court. This had a huge impact. Literally millions of people watched it and suddenly realized what it meant to have international criminal justice, what it meant to have somebody who'd been a despicable criminal, but in very specific and particular circumstances, now answering to a global tribunal. In fact, on the initiative of the government of Uganda, because otherwise he would, the ICC would not have had the competence to do so. Now, the problem, of course, is that this calls on what is a characteristic of social media, instant emotion. And how do we translate this into a broader, more continued view, a sort of thoughtful process of going a little deeper into things and getting organized to do something about them? This is the great challenge. And I believe it can only be done through having within the networks sort of nodes of people who transform those instant messages into more articulate, more sophisticated proposals and give them concrete perspectives. The Occupy Wall Street movement was before, I think, a European issue, and it was invented by a radical revolutionary, a 90-year-old person, Stéphane Hessel. He was in the French Resistance. He was actually born German, and at a given moment, he wrote a little book saying there are certain things which are unacceptable. We should indignate ourselves. This was pure emotion, yet he has transformed this into a slogan, a motto which has gone around the world and which can sort of crystallize on given issues. Maybe we are somewhere before in May 1968 on the global scale. This is, I'm sorry to say, a very selfish view because I was 20 in May 1968. But this is another thing sociologists never saw coming. Nobody knew when and how the upcoming baby boomers would start having that social conscience. Let us hope that the upcoming world youth, which has manifested itself on Tahrir Square and other places, will have that social conscience.
Anybody else? Mr. Malik?
Yeah, just to add to this, I think I fully agree. I think there's a rising set of expectations among people. They want things to be done better. They want a system which responds to their basic needs as human beings. And the fact that there are large numbers of the world, especially young people who are connected to each other, is a profoundly important force, I would say, in society now. The Arab Spring happened in countries which were relatively high on our human development status. Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, we still do not know how that works out. And even in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, they said that when they first met, they were quite impressed by the fact they could meet. The mobilization came later. And then each time they could discuss amongst themselves, so their ambitions got more precise, more political, and more profound. And I think this is as true in the Middle East as it is true in China. We are on to something now. Whether that can be directed is a different issue. Maybe it's best not to direct it too much, but to make it very much a way of understanding it, that this is something for the future now.
Yeah, I was surprised at Tahrir Square that they were so self-confident they allowed a documentary to go simultaneously as they were organizing the demonstrations. I'd never seen that before, instant documentation of a process that was ongoing. Lester, you have any?
I just wanted to say briefly that the internet has played an important role in the Beyond Coal campaign, for example. Beyond Coal started with opposing new coal-fired power plants. That was the first stage. That's pretty much history now. But what they discovered was, and they created an information center on the internet, specifically on coal. And what they discovered was that there was a strategy, a legal strategy in court that was working very well in challenging new coal plants on the basis that the companies had not done a least cost analysis before deciding on coal. They hadn't looked at investing in efficiency or wind or what have you. And so that was the argument that won, that led to the rejection, the refusal or cancellation of licenses for new coal plants. But it was very clear that it was a shared experience. And coal plants are always stopped or closed at the local level. That's where coal plants are. But it's the sharing the experience of what works. And you know, how you go about closing a coal plant in your neighborhood is not something that's part of our education. So it has to be learned, and the internet's been an important part of that learning process.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
David, you want to say something?
Yes, I'm sorry.
I did want to say something, but it was...
No, please, I did not see your hand.
No, but it wasn't really on social media. So I just wanted to take issue a bit with what Lester said, that your emissions are falling. And of course, China's carbon dioxide emissions are now higher than the United States. So China has now passed the United States. But now let's look at what those emissions are doing. Embedded carbon is coming in as imports to your country. So if I now count the concept of embedded carbon, 2/3 to 3/4 of the United States carbon dioxide emissions go into manufacturing goods that are then imported into the United States. Yes. So as a matter of fact, your emissions, if I count imported carbon, are now almost twice any other country, if I count that. What this means, I think, is that, and there's a connection with the last discussion we had. Effectively, your manufacturing sector has collapsed, and you're importing manufactured goods from China in particular. Now, what that means is that if we're managing a global problem such as CO2 emissions, we have to look very carefully at what happens at our borders. And this is precisely why President Barroso of the European Commission went to China and said, your imported carbon, we're going to have to tax it at the same rate as we pay for carbon emissions in Europe. And the response of Barroso, of the Chinese, which was already coming into play, was, no, we're going to introduce a carbon dioxide cap and trade ourselves. So rather than pay at the border, they are effectively introducing a cap and trade, which avoids that problem. It's a different issue to the social media, but I just felt this is terribly important. Great. We need to look at this globally.
Okay, we have other questions, but why don't you give brief responses?
Just very quickly, I agree with your general point, David. I would just add a few things that sometimes get left out of the calculation. One of those is that the United States is the breadbasket of the world. We export enormous amounts of grain, and it takes carbon to produce that grain. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is with
Bread
China.
basket of the world, I would challenge that, but continue.
You would challenge which?
The bread basket of the world.
Well, if you look at grain exports, I mean, we totally dominate. We export more grain than Canada, Australia, and Argentina combined, for example. So we have a huge export.
It's a bread basket versus consumption. That's the point he's making. Huh?
Right.
I mean,
the other point is that it is true China's exporting an enormous amount of manufactured goods with embedded carbon. We can't question that, and we are the beneficiaries of that in the carbon accounting. But the soybeans imported into China now are huge. Their soybean consumption went from 14 million tons to 70 million tons, and because of that, they have literally transformed the agriculture in the Western Hemisphere to the point where we now have more land in soybeans than either wheat or corn. The irony of this is that soybeans are the crop that China gave to the world. Anyhow, there are a lot of agricultural calculations that go into this as well.
can I just, this is becoming an interesting conversation. A quick point. China, I mean, this also talks about markets and things. If China were to follow in its agriculture, to allow it to be freely produced and marketed, Chinese cereal consumption is greater than the current world trade in cereals. Numbers matter. So I think one has to be very careful when you look at these issues in terms of one country only, but look at the totality of how this will affect the whole world. Huh?
Yes.
I'm Stefan Richter. I edit the Globalist and online magazine. My question throughout this conference is whether we don't have an elephant in the room that I would call schizophrenia. We're 1 mile away from the US Capitol. When we grew up, whether we are baby boomers or younger than that, the US was always the can-do country, the pragmatists. The others were, in Vartan's words, the talkers, not the doers. That has profoundly shifted. If we look at NGOs, we almost have an escapist trend in the United States because for all the great work that the NGOs are doing, they're almost achieving next to nothing, despite what Lester said about the Sierra Club on the home front. They're great at providing advice on a global basis, but they're fatally losing the battle at home. So if we have this incongruousness, plus the fact that the United States was always the power of optimism, how long is that ago? And the rest of the world was doubtful and pessimistic. How do we, in terms of getting to the previous question about social media, about making this interoperable, making this politically relevant, how do we get out of this box? We have only two choices in that sense. Either make the United States more optimistic, and after this conference, I'm not sure that many of us think in that direction. So the question becomes, how can we continue the trend from the Bush administration in some sense, which was totally unilateralist, but did more on a global effective basis to force multilateralism because we couldn't look up to Big Daddy anymore and had to do it ourselves. So how do we make this operational? Because other than that, I think we're going to move in circles and not address the elephant in the room. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody want to answer that?
Well, one would have to be American to answer that,
exactly,
I
I was going to say that.
Let me say candidly...
But Frenchman is the right approach.
For an outsider, it's fascinating to see when you had your campaign in 2002, there was a candidate, Al Gore, which was aware of a certain number of global realities and ready to speak about them. He didn't win the election, that's another story. But there was a certain degree in the election. Now, if you look in the series of elections we have around the world, after all, we have elections in Russia, in China, in France, we will have them in Germany, in Italy, we have become completely introvert. It's not only an American phenomenon, it's all about the economic issues, and it's all about very narrow cultural issues, with all the issues which we are sharing here practically out of the picture. That's the impact of the crisis. This is probably a generational fact. This is very worrying, because the voices that should raise those issues are not being heard, are not getting through. And I think I mentioned earlier that one would probably have to wait for this wave of elections to create a new set of leaders to rekindle their awareness and their interest. This may coincide with what Lester is saying. After all, if we have a bad summer next summer and grain prices suddenly shoot up and we have real scarcities on world markets, this is going to be a tremendous wake-up call. And could happen also in oil. You're focused on grain, but oil is also something that politicians pay an enormous amount of attention to.
Yes.
You know, I think there's another issue. I agree entirely with Marc. We've become introverted, narrow cultural and economic purview. But I think there's another factor that is very new, at least since the 1980s, which is the short time span we have. If I just take a few measures, one of them would be from the New York Stock Exchange. It's almost unbelievable to look at the data. Between 1940 and 1980, the average holding of shares was between 6 and 9 years. That's the average time somebody held on to shares, which meant, presumably, that the directors of those companies were able to think long term. The average holding is now 3 months, and of course many of the holdings are down at the microsecond level. And so the companies are having to give quarterly returns. There are very few people within the private sector worrying about long-term trends. Now, we are in what I believe is the first phase of an avalanche, and so I'm going to quote from Voltaire. Voltaire said, "No snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible." Because the snowflake is only worried about where it lands at that moment.
Yeah, but don't forget also Voltaire was a grain speculator.
Yes,
That's why he lived in the other side of Geneva, so it would not be anyway.
So the point I'm making is just about short-termism.
Yeah.
We need to think what the planet's going to look like in 50 years' time. I've got a 2-year-old grandson who's likely to be around 100 years from now because of the increased lifespan. 100 years from now, what will the planet look like? I'm afraid we're no longer embedding long-term thinking into our decision-making because it's all become short-term driven.
Yes, but
I cannot but compliment David in highlighting a tremendously important issue of long-termism. The question is how to get to that, and leadership does matter. I think we talked about civil society, but in some ways you have to mobilize an idea, a concept, and translate that into policy and some initiatives to make things happen. And being a Pakistani, I know perfectly well what it means not to have good leadership. When leadership does not work, you know profoundly its consequences. So how do we generate, mobilize leadership that will save the world? And because that's what we are talking about. I think we have to find a way to bring the various communities together into a purposeful way of resolving these issues. I think I am not as sanguine as David was on Copenhagen, because I was also there and I realized that we missed a rather profound opportunity actually. But somehow we have to address that. And whether we pray for good leaders or we kind of manufacture them, we have to address this issue.
You want to add anything else, Lester?
Just very quickly, and Stefan's question sort of reminded me of this. We focus on manufacturing in this country, and we really have lost it. There's no question about that. At the same time, if you look at information technology companies, start making a list. You know, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, I mean, the whole thing. Almost all the major IT companies in the world are, originated here, and were headed by young Americans, 19 years old, 21 years old, not people approaching retirement. And it was it's kind of a new page in industrial, or in, I should say, in economic development, where the ideas suddenly come from 20-year-olds instead of 40 or 50 or 60-year-olds. But it's been extraordinarily successful.
But Lester, that manufacturing capability is not in the United States. The chips are manufactured elsewhere, the bits and pieces.
The ideas have come from the United States, and that's also an interesting question. It's more a social question, but you're right. But
Okay, let's see. And then you.
Hi, I'm Kristen Weiss with Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, and I have terrible stage fright, so I will read off of this. So you mentioned that 20th century solutions are no longer applicable in today's world, and we now have a large population of the global population being under the age of 35, who, in my opinion, are definitely capable and ready to problem solve and tackle 21st century problems and provide 21st century solutions. So my question is, what are the immediate next steps that we should all take to foster the next generation of foreign policy leaders and to empower them to tackle these sooner rather than later?
Okay, thank you. Who would care to respond?
May I take a risk? Because I do have a slight difference with Lester. Some of the 20th century solutions have not been tried. And everything we've been discussing about climate change, about education, about environment points to the fact that we need much stronger global institutions. Call it global governance, don't call it world government because it's an ugly word nowadays, but nevertheless that there has to be somewhere a capacity to determine priorities and to spread the will to implement those priorities. Not sure whether we need a global budget or legislation or anything. I think the wave of the 21st century is that it will be done by peer pressure, by networking, by many initiatives from all sectors of civil society, including business, which is a key driving force. But we certainly need that. And this is where it's up to everybody to come up with their ideas. Well, after all, seize power. You're the young ones. This is a world you are building for yourselves. This panel, with all due respect for all of us, will probably be out of commission by the time things get really rough in terms of climate change. But hopefully you will still be there. So the sense of urgency which we all have on all those topics should be an encouragement for the younger crowd, not to wait for us to take their hand, but to raise their fist.
Okay.
Could I respond by saying we've got many challenges. Climate change I've described as the biggest, but alongside climate change is inertia. Inertia in our cultural systems, inertia in our built environment. We have enormous inertia. I have to say, listening to the previous discussion about the role of the military, that's a discussion that was about the 20th century. So what we need, and you can see where I'm going with this, is young people who can reinvent the future. Don't rely on the way we've been operating over the past 100 years. This is not relevant. You guys have to get into the driving seat. That's the absolute key, because it's the inertia from the old ways of living that has to be overcome. Very few economists understand about the role of inertia. We are trapped with automobiles. We're trapped with our road systems. We're trapped in a mode of behavior that we can easily overcome. And that's what I was trying to say. We are doing that in Europe, but it requires an enormous groundswell of change. I'm talking about a cultural change, like a renaissance. And over to your generation. It's got to be up to you guys.
There's one question here that's been patiently waiting to ask. So if you can bring, and then there are two others. Very brief.
I'm Reggie Winsinger, and I'm a director of the W.P. Carey Company. And I wanted to point out, David, that the founder of our company, whose name is behind you, is, of course, is behind the sponsorship. is a very long-term thinker. As a matter of fact, the motto of our company is invest for the long term. So not all of us are that way. I wanted to make that point to you.
Thank you. If that was a correction, I do stand corrected.
We have only, I regret, we have only 39 seconds now. So I'd like to conclude this by thanking our panelists, but also raising one or two questions, which I had to ask, but there's no possibility of response. One of them is the military academy connection has produced internet. After each war, major technological changes have happened, the 20s until now. I hope we don't need another war to have this invention. But one of the things is that the changes, what David was mentioning, some of the changes have happened in spite of, but as a result of military thing. Night warfare, GPS, everything we have and so forth.
Jet aircraft.
All of it. Second is, we did not discuss education, which is dear to my heart. In every society, we have inculcated the love of learning, education as a liberating force, and also education as possibility of creating democratic societies, which this morning I was discussing. But there is great gap between capacity and aspiration of this. And I think that's going to be one of the most destabilizing forces in the world, because unlike here, there's no inertia there. Everybody wants to have it now, regardless whether the resources are there or not. And that's the kind of thing I was alluding when I opened the meeting, Lord Gray saying it's easy to mobilize, but very hard to demobilize. Social media is mobilizing everybody's aspirations, but there's no capacity, quoting Marc, for a worldwide organization to deliver. And then I'd like to add one optimistic note on this discussion. I'm very happy that the United States has 1.6 million nonprofit organizations. Today, 1 out of 10 Americans work for nonprofits. So there is a civil society in the United States which has fulfilled the aspiration of de Tocqueville, who came and wrote the classic work, Democracy in America, 1830s, still a classic, where he coined for the first time, I think, if I'm not mistaken, participatory democracy, that Americans were participating when they took their street, they cleaned it, they did not wait for somebody to come. When they took initiative, everything about justice and all of this, they were doing the job of democracy. So my hope is that all our youth and everybody else around the world will build civil society in order to challenge governments, challenge ideologies, challenge everything for the cause of social justice and freedom around the world. So thank you very much for this one.
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for that last observation, because we did raise the issue of the potential of philanthropy, which in effect you've raised with the mirror image of the not-for-profits. I should just remember and remind ourselves that, yes, the ideas came from the States, and yes, the manufacturing went overseas, but the entrepreneurial zeal to get those ideas into products came from the States. So I can't help feeling that that entrepreneurial, innovative quality is going to address the manufacturing issue as well, and indeed, it's probably already starting, because the cost structure of China, we're going to hear more about that, is changing dramatically, and the competitiveness of the US, I suspect, is going to be improving really quite rapidly. In the competition on quotes, I'm not going to re-enter it, but but I would remind you that short-termism, and I'm extremely glad that's back on the table, investment decisions are made in strange places. Voltaire, we hear, was a speculator.
Part-time, not full-time.
Well, talk about part-time. The two others I can think of immediately were Proust and Keynes. Now, their decision-making was original. Proust was made in bed, and Keynes in the bath. So remember that. Short-termism, it depends how long you're going to have a bath for. Anyway, let's go and have some lunch and come back at 1:30. 1:30, all right?
Okay.